Alright, hi everyone, how's it going? I'm back here today with another video. Now, in my last video I was talking about Korean history, and I was talking about a number of different key events in Korean history. Korean history goes back very far, so I was unable to include everything, but I did include certain, key events that I wanted to include in Korean history. Now, this video I want to kind of continue my last video. And where I left off last time was around the period of Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula. And this happened in 1910. Japan annexed Korea, and they controlled it for a period of 35 years. And they greatly increased the infrastructure of Korea. They built a lot of railroads, roads, bridges, all sorts of things, but they also committed a lot of atrocities on the Koreans as well. Now, World War II ended in 1945. Right before it ended, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. And I did mention that in the last video. I know Soviet Union declared war on Japan, and the war wasn't going to last too much longer. Japan was defeated, and after that both sides divided the Korean Peninsula. You had the Soviet Union take over the northern part, and the Allied forces take over the southern part of the peninsula, and they were divided along the 38th parallel. Now, initially there was an agreement, because at this point the U.S. and the Soviet Union were still allies. There was an agreement that there would be free, open, democratic elections in both North and South Korea, but almost immediately Russia started to arm North Korea and supply it with all kinds of military vehicles, tanks, planes, guns, all sorts of things, and greatly built up the army of North Korea. And in South Korea, the U.S. and the Allied forces didn't really do too much to build up South Korea. So, what happened was Stalin had installed the leader of North Korea, who at this time was Kim Il-sung. And Kim Il-sung had fought alongside Stalin. He had fought in the Red Army during World War II. And when World War II ended, he was installed in North Korea as sort of a puppet. Sort of like a puppet leader. And Stalin then decided that North Korea should, take over the whole peninsula and establish a communist regime in the entire peninsula. Stalin didn't feel that the United States would intervene because, the United States didn't really intervene a whole lot in the communist takeover of China, which was only, 1 year before this time. So because the United States didn't intervene, Stalin kind of thought they wouldn't intervene on the Korean Peninsula, but of course he was wrong. Now, what happened was, with the North Korean army greatly built up, the North Koreans went over the 38th parallel and very quickly took over the southern part of the Korean Peninsula. All but this little 50 square mile region in the southern part of the peninsula. And the United States and the UN felt that something should be done. So a UN coalition was created with mostly, the United States was the largest part of this coalition. They sent over around 300,000 troops into Korea, and the rest of the UN forces had about 40,000. So it was around an army of around 340,000 strong. And the leader of this was General Douglas MacArthur. General Douglas MacArthur was already a war hero. He was very popular at this point. He was still stationed in Japan, but he really had a lot of fame and popularity at this point. Might have possibly even been able to have become a Republican president had it not been for the way the events unfolded in Korea. But, yeah, what happened there was the Allied forces were then going to retake the Korean Peninsula because it had been almost completely overrun by communist forces. They had taken almost the entire thing, except for that one little small area in the southern tip of the peninsula. So what Douglas MacArthur decided to do was to flank them. So what he did was he got a bunch of ships, and they were going to launch an amphibious assault behind enemy lines and flank them from the side. That was the plan that Douglas MacArthur had, and this is going to be the largest amphibious assault since D-Day. Got all these troops on ships, and they launched a massive assault. Very quickly, the UN forces were able to regain Seoul, and then they were able to regain a lot of South Korea. And then Douglas MacArthur said, well, let's not stop there. Let's retake the whole of the peninsula for South Korea. Let's unify the entire peninsula, and it'll be unified under, Syngman Rhee, and it'll be a republic, and it'll spread from the southern tip of the peninsula all the way to Manchuria. He wanted to conquer the whole thing and just have Syngman Rhee be president of the entire peninsula. And that was what they then did. They then pushed up north all the way into Manchuria very quickly, so the tide changed very fast. And now the UN forces had controlled the entire peninsula. Well, what then happened after this was the Chinese got involved. Now, China, they were told that, we got to kick the imperialists out of this peninsula. So China very quickly mobilized 500,000 troops in Manchuria. And then they pushed into northern Korea with over 200,000 troops, and very intense fighting followed. There was some very intense fighting. The UN troops were very quickly pushed back, and there were some battles where there were quite a few losses. There was one called the Big Bug Out, which was the worst U.S. defeat in over a century. It was like 11,000 Americans were killed. And, it was very difficult at this point because you had very harsh conditions. Korea, is very mountainous, especially in the northern part. Very mountainous, very rocky. And then you have the winter, and the cold Siberian winter came in around November, and a lot of people froze. So very catastrophic what was happening here. And then the UN troops were pushed southward toward the 38th parallel again. And then at this point, Douglas MacArthur was just like, okay, you know what? I got a solution. We'll hit China with 50 atomic bombs. And then at this point, President Truman, had to make a decision, and he decided to just fire MacArthur. Because who knows what would have been the repercussions of that, right? Who knows? I mean, that could have started a world war very easily. I mean, Russia probably would have retaliated with their nuclear weapons, and maybe they would have launched a nuclear strike on South Korea, or maybe the United States. Who knows? But Truman had to fire MacArthur. And that was, kind of unpopular at the time because, like I said, General MacArthur was very popular for his military victories against Japan. And now he was, fired, relieved of his duties. General Ridgway, I believe, was his replacement. And shortly after this time, they began to start peace talks, or talks of some sort of an armistice. But whatever it was, for whatever reason, agreements were not reached, and fighting continued for 2 more years. And what happened in, from 51 to 53 was both sides kind of dug in and trench warfare ensued. Very reminiscent of what you had happen during World War I. You had this trench warfare where both sides were dug in, and there was just this, brutal stalemate. And ultimately, in 1953, a armistice was reached, and a ceasefire was established. The Korean War never officially ended. It just stopped with a ceasefire. So technically, the Korean War is still going on today. There's just this, ceasefire agreement. You could make the argument that it's the longest running war in American history. I mean, you could make that argument because in some ways, it never ended. It's just this ceasefire. So that's what you had happen there. Now, the Korean War is often called the Forgotten War. And for a long time, I didn't even know the Korean War even existed. I did not know that. I mean, I thought it was pretty much World War II and then the Vietnam War. I didn't know there was a Korean War. But, sometimes it's even referred to as a police action and not a war. But when you consider the number of people that have died, and there's quite a few. Now, the official estimate of U.S. troops killed in the Korean War used to be around 54,000. But what happened around 94 is the Pentagon then said that the official number of U.S. troops killed in the Korean War by the fighting itself was 33,000 U.S. troops. And another 3,000 were killed by disease and accidents and other things unrelated to the combat, for a total of around pretty close to 37,000, not quite. It was around 36,900. But as far as Koreans, there was a massive bombing campaign of North Korea, and the number of Koreans killed was around 3 million. So it was really, huge loss of life in the Korean War. A lot of people had been killed. Now, like I said, never officially ended. But one thing I do want to add is, you did see some new things in the Korean War, and that was a lot of jet fighters. Now, you had jet fighters at the end of World War II, but my understanding is you really had a lot of jet fighters fighting it out in dogfights during the Korean War. For example, at this point, the U.S. had the F-80 Shooting Star jet, and the F-80 was, a good, very maneuverable jet fighter. But then, coming out of Chinese bases were MiG-15s. And that really took the UN forces by surprise. I mean, they had no idea that the communists could produce such a maneuverable aircraft, and it really was. The MiG-15 could outmaneuver anything the UN forces had, and they were greatly, worried about this because there was a general idea in the Korean War that the UN troops were going to be up against very, they would be up against very inexperienced third world troops and who had, very lightly armed, not a lot of technology, and then all of a sudden there's these very technologically advanced MiG-15s coming into the fight. So then the U.S. retaliated with the F-86 Sabre aircraft, and that was able to challenge the MiG-15, and able to kind of nullify it, so it wasn't a major factor in the dogfighting that was going on. But that was kind of unexpected to see these MiG-15s just kind of appear like that. But yeah, so Korean War, like I said, it ended along the 38th parallel with an armistice agreement, and it pretty much ended where it started. The country was still divided. The peninsula was not unified. There had been this huge war, and it all kind of ended pretty much where it had begun. So, there's this demilitarized zone, or DMZ, that stretches between North and South Korea, and it's very heavily guarded from what I understand. There's a lot of landmines in it. But, yeah, so that was, the Korean War. First leader, I already mentioned, was Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung, like I said, he had received training from the Soviet Union. They sort of installed him initially as a puppet. My understanding, received a lot of support from the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union was still around, they received a lot of support and aid. And the economy of North Korea at one point was kind of booming. I mean, it was growing. It was pretty strong. Now, all that changed in the 80s. In the 80s, it completely reversed because the economy of North Korea was actually stronger than the economy of South Korea until the 80s. In the 80s, like I said, it all reversed. And then South Korea, it developed more industry, and it developed a very strong technology sector, and, kind of reminiscent of what you have today. But, at that time, though, it all changed in the 80s, and Kim Il-sung died in 1994. His son Kim Jong-il took over. And around this time, North Korea's economy was weakening. To make matters worse, in the 90s, from around 94 to 98, you had widespread famine in North Korea. And a lot of people had died as a result of this. There were a lot of people trying to defect, to leave North Korea. And North Korea really took on the shape that, it has today. This very oppressive totalitarian regime, that you have there. And, what eventually happened was the government of North Korea kind of took on the shape it is now. I believe they call it Jurch, I think is the word. Don't quote me on that, but I believe it's like Jurch, where it's a different kind of system than what you had in the Soviet Union with, communism. And that it's like a different kind of system where, the leaders are revered as gods, essentially. And there's this, cult of personality, as they call it, where they're greatly revered. When Kim Jong-il died in 2011, and I've seen documentaries on this, there was forced mourning where all the people at his funeral had to cry for his death and they were kind of forced to do so. And if you didn't cry as much, you could be jailed, be sent to a labor camp. It was very easy to be sent to a labor camp in North Korea. One slight little thing, and you're in a labor camp. To be sent to a labor camp for possessing South Korean movies. South Korean movies. A lot of people in North Korea will smuggle in these, DVDs, because there is a film industry in South Korea, kind of big, from what I understand, and people will smuggle in movies from South Korea into North Korea. The women usually liking dramas and soap operas, where the men particularly like action movies. No different than it really is anywhere else, right? But that's what you have happening. There's not a lot of electric power, too, in North Korea. As you can see right here, this map kind of illustrates that, right? This is Korea. As you can see, South Korea, very heavily lit up. All kinds of electric power, and as you can see, quite a bit. But then in North Korea, there's not a whole lot. You have this part right over here. That would be the capital, Pyongyang. The rest of North Korea, all the villages and all that, they don't get a lot of electric power. Maybe there'd be like an hour of electric power that would come to North Korea a day. Sometimes it's very late at night. So if you want to watch a movie or something, you got to do it in secrecy late at night. And if you get found out, you could get in huge trouble. You can be sent to a labor camp, and, all kinds of terrible things could happen to you. So, very oppressive regime. When people from the West are making documentaries and that, and they go into it. For example, like Vice, Shane Smith, I'll use this as an example because I know Vice has a documentary on that where Shane Smith, went into North Korea, and they had to have these like special North Korean tour guides following them around wherever they went, making sure they saw only the things that the North Korean regime wanted them to see. And, they didn't want North Korea to be painted in a bad light. They didn't want real graphic images to come out of North Korea. But graphic images have made their way out of North Korea. I think some North Korean soldiers who will not be named, refuse to be mentioned by name, have taken like video footage of what some of these North Korean villages outside of, Pyongyang, the capital, are like. They've showed, how harsh the conditions are and, how bad the people have it over there. But, so now, as of 2011, Kim Jong-il died. Initially, his successor was going to be one of his sons. But apparently that son tried to go to Japan to go to, I believe, a Japanese Disney that was there. Tokyo Disney, I think he wanted to go to, and he had like a bad visa. And he fell out of favor with the North Korean regime because of this. So the successor was then to be Kim Jong-un. And Kim Jong-un has been in power since 2011. And first they weren't sure how things were going to be. I thought maybe he might kind of make the North Korean economy kind of like a mixed economy, like what you have in China. They weren't sure what things were going to be like. That was what Kim Jong-un's uncle wanted to do. He wanted to make the North Korean economy a lot like the Chinese economy. This mixed kind of socialistic and capitalistic economy, but his uncle was unable to do that because when Kim Jong-un found out about that, he had his uncle executed. And so he had his uncle executed. Now, North Korea supposedly has a lot of things that, they could take advantage of, but I guess they don't. Like, it has a lot of coal, also has a lot of rare earth minerals that, could be exported into China, because the Chinese use a lot of these, like, rare earth minerals in their electronics. So they definitely, this could grow the North Korean economy, but nothing happens because the Kim regime is so oppressive. Kim Jong-un has proved to be very oppressive. And, I didn't even mention the North Korean nuclear program, which has also been going on. And you're always hearing in the news of North Korea launching missiles. And my understanding was, although I don't know that it's entirely known, but my understanding was that North Korea had probably about 3 nuclear weapons in their possession, but they weren't able to miniaturize it, to put it onto a missile, to, send it out into space. They've been able to send it out into space, but then it has to come back down if it's going to be long range. And it's been able to go into space, but then, it wouldn't able to, make it impact where they wanted it to impact, and they weren't very long range. So far, they haven't been very effective. Supposedly, recently, they launched one that did make it relatively far. I think it was like 400 or 500 miles or so. I think they were aiming it at Japan. But ultimately, kind of North Korea does kind of want to control its region. Long-range nuclear weapon would kind of disrupt the balance of power that you have in that region. And it would give North Korea more say. So that's why, no one wants North Korea to have these long-range nuclear weapons. There have been sanctions put on them, but North Korea ignores these sanctions. And, who knows what will ultimately happen here. Ultimately, I do think there will be a reunification of the Korean Peninsula. It's just a question of how does that happen, and what are the circumstances surrounding that, and what does Kim Jong-un have to do in order to cause the U.S. to get involved. I mean, what ultimately would happen, I don't know, but I do think ultimately the Korean Peninsula will be reunified. Kim Jong-un, that's one of the things he wants to do. He wants to reunify it as, one, like, North Korean style government. And obviously the South Koreans don't want that. So, as far as the army is concerned, North Korea has a very large army, very disproportionate for its economy, very large. And you have that with those, Soviet-era regimes, right? You have very disproportionately large armies where other aspects of the economy are very weak, but very powerful military. And you have that in North Korea. But North Korea does have its military weaknesses as well. Do have some info kind of on that. The Air Force in particular is kind of weak and outdated. A lot of Soviet-era equipment in the Air Force. U.S. has 2,296 fighter jets, as where North Korea has 458 fighters. U.S. is way more trainer aircraft. Tank strength, U.S. is 5,884 in tank strength. Korea, around 5,025. Pretty close in tank strength. If you look at like total artillery, U.S. is 2,299. North Korea's 4,300. So North Korea is heavy on artillery. As I understand too, they have actually a pretty advanced missile system as well. Always launching missiles, but as far as the number of missiles they do have quite a few. As far as Aircraft carriers, U.S. has 19, North Korea doesn't have any. Submarines are pretty close. Destroyers, U.S. has 63, North Korea doesn't have any. And as far as, manpower and all that, North Korean army is pretty large. As far as I know, the statistics on that is North Korea has available manpower about 13 million, which, there's only about 24 million people in all of North Korea. U.S. has a 145 million for manpower available. Now, fit for service, currently it's like 120 million for North Korea and around 10 million. 120 million for the U.S., around 10 million for North Korea. So it kind of varies. Active military personnel, United States, 1.4 million, North Korea, 700,000. Active military reserves, U.S., 1.1 million, North Korea, 4.5 million. And, I already talked about aircraft, helicopters, U.S. is around over 6,000, North Korea around 200. TAC helicopters, U.S. close to 1,000, North Korea 20. U.S. really has a much more powerful and more sophisticated Air Force than North Korea does. And all pretty much, as far as I know, most of the equipment that the U.S. has at its disposal is much more